All right, so get ready, because today we're taking a deep dive into something both fascinating and kind of unsettling.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's the history of prison punishments.
Okay.
We're going way back, exploring how different societies throughout time dealt with crime and those who, well, like to break the rules.
I'm intrigued.
Right. But before we jump into the really intense stuff, got to put it out there, this isn't about, like, glorifying cruelty or anything.
Of course, of course.
It's more about understanding, like
Yeah.
how these punishments reflect, the values and anxieties of the time. And hey, maybe even force us to confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves.
Right, yeah.
You up for it?
Absolutely. See, what I find so compelling about this kind of exploration is that it's not just about the punishments themselves, it's about what they reveal. About how power structures have maintained control throughout history. It's a window into how societies define justice, how norms evolved.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I've got this article here, and it's outlining the evolution of these punishments. And let me tell you, it gets pretty wild. Like, right off the bat, we're hit with punishments that weren't just about pain. They were about public humiliation.
Mm-hmm.
Like, imagine being caught for, say, public drunkenness in 17th century England.
Okay. Yeah.
And your punishment is you have to walk around in a giant barrel,
A barrel.
a whole barrel. They called it the drunkard's cloak.
The drunkard's cloak. Wow. It's almost comical.
Right.
But then, yeah, you realize the impact, the effectiveness of that kind of public shaming in that time. The Newcastle cloak, it was called too, right?
That's the one. And, it wasn't just for the men either. There were ways to correct women's behavior, too.
Oh, absolutely. We see that with things like the scold's bridle, right?
Exactly. The scold's bridle.
Basically a muzzle to silence women who were deemed, too outspoken or gossipy. It's a chilling example of how these punishments were used to, reinforce those patriarchal structures,
Yeah.
right? Keeping women in check. And then there's the cucking stool, another punishment specifically designed to humiliate women, often by dunking them in water, control their speech.
It's incredible, right? You start to wonder, what were they so afraid of? These women, they were a threat, not necessarily physically, but to the whole system.
Mm-hmm.
But enough about shaming for now. Let's move on to punishments that are less about humiliation and more about, well, sheer brutality. This article takes us on quite the tour. Time periods, continents, you name it, each with its own brand of, well,
I'm almost afraid to ask.
like hanging in chains.
Yeah.
Popular in 17th century Scotland.
Oh, God.
Yeah, where people were suspended, usually by their wrists, and left to die slowly from exposure and just exhaustion.
The agony of that, the slow, excruciating strain on their joints, the dehydration, the helplessness. It's a punishment designed not for a swift death, but for prolonged suffering, serving as that gruesome warning to anyone who even thought about challenging the status quo.
And then you've got your water dungeons, used throughout history from medieval Europe all the way to 20th century China. Basically, they'd throw someone in this small, dark cell, and slowly water would start rising.
Oh, God, the psychological terror of that. The rising water, the cold, that dampness, the feeling of slowly being buried alive. It's a form of torture that really preys on our deepest fears, using the environment as a weapon.
And speaking of using the environment as a weapon, our next stop is the American Civil War.
Yeah.
And, well, let's just say if tight spaces aren't your thing, you're not going to like this one.
Okay, listening.
It's called the sweat box, sometimes just the box. Pretty self-explanatory. They cram someone in this tiny airless box. And, well, that was kind of it.
Just left there to suffer. The heat, the lack of oxygen, dehydration, heat stroke. The article, it mentions Fort Spokane out in Washington Territory. Horrific conditions there.
So we've got humiliation, we've got the elements, we've got confinement. But we're not done. Up next, we're going deep on a category of punishments so infamous, so brutal, that they've left a real mark on history. And here's the disturbing part, some of them still used today. We've talked about some rough stuff, but one that really gets me, and this is one that bridges that gap between history and the present, is bastinado.
Bastinado, yeah.
It just sounds so simple, right? Whipping the soles of the feet.
It sounds almost too simple, right? But what makes it so insidious is that it exploits the body's own anatomy to inflict maximum pain. The soles of our feet, incredibly sensitive, right? Packed with nerve endings.
Yeah, the article mentioned that, something like 200,000. Makes me cringe just thinking about it.
It's excruciating pain, but the damage is often internal. So it was seen as a cleaner form of punishment, at least on the surface. And that made it pretty appealing to,
those who wanted to inflict pain, without leaving those lasting visible marks.
Exactly. And the truly disturbing part is it's still used in some parts of the world today. I mean, even in prisons, it's a stark reminder that the evolution of punishment, it's not always linear, is it?
No, it's not. Some things, they stick around.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder why. But speaking of punishments with a long and let's face it, troubling history, let's talk about the Kang.
The carrying. Okay.
This was a Chinese punishment. Involved this large wooden collar they'd put around someone's neck, sometimes for like days, even weeks at a time.
I mean, it might not sound as immediately brutal as some of the others we've talked about, but the psychological torture, significant.
Yeah.
To be completely immobilized, unable to feed yourself, take care of basic needs.
Would even lie down comfortably.
It chipped away at your dignity, your sense of self.
Yeah. And it gets worse, right? They didn't just use it for any crime. The article connects it to political oppression. Like during the Boxer Rebellion, anyone who challenged the powers that be, can't.
It's interesting, right, how these punishments, they often targeted not just the body, but the mind, the spirit.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another punishment designed to, I guess you could say, break the spirit. Shifting gears geographically and chronologically here, we're going to Victorian-era England. And, well, have you ever heard of the crank machine?
Crank machine, vaguely.
It was this invention that forced prisoners to perform meaningless labor. Basically, they just turn this crank for hours on end, no purpose to it other than to inflict suffering.
It sounds like something straight out of a dystopian novel, just pointless suffering.
Yeah, and you know what's fascinating, what's terrifying, is that the true horror wasn't the physical part, it was the mental toll it took.
Oh, absolutely. The monotony, the pointlessness, that knowledge that every action, every movement you made was futile. It was mental torture.
Drove people to the brink. And the guards, and they could manipulate the machine, increase the tension, make it physically harder, just break them down even more. So we've covered a lot here. Shaming, physical torture, psychological manipulation, humans. We're a creative bunch, especially when it comes to, well, punishing each other. But we're not done. This article, it saves the, I guess you could say best for last, the top 3 most brutal punishments in history. And yeah, they do not hold back.
Oh, boy. Okay. I'm ready, I think. Hit me with it.
What takes the bronze medal in this horrific lineup?
All right, so coming in at number 3, we have gibbeting. Now imagine this. You've been sentenced to death, which horrific on its own, right? But instead of, a swift end, your body is then put on display in a metal cage, left there to rot in the elements as a warning to others.
Oh, my God. That's a whole other level. I mean, it's one thing to, punish someone while they're alive, but to continue that punishment after death.
It's about spectacle, shock and horrify people into submission, a very grim reminder of power and the lengths, well, some will go to maintain it.
Gruesome is an understatement. Where was this practiced?
It was big in 18th century England and colonial America, too. Public executions, they were, unfortunately, a bit of a spectator sport back then. Can you imagine?
The smell alone. It's both fascinating and appalling that something so barbaric was just acceptable for so long. It's wild. What's even crazier is the article said that it eventually declined because of public health concerns. Apparently, the stench of rotting corpses was a bit much, even for them. So what could possibly top that? Public displays of rotting corpses, what could be worse? What earns the silver medal in this gruesome countdown?
Well, gibbeting is definitely hard to top in the, ick factor.
Right.
But the silver medal in our little countdown here goes to a punishment that's more about psychological torment. It's called the pear of anguish.
Pear of anguish. Okay, yeah. That name alone is not a good sign. I'm already kind of terrified. What is it?
So it's this device, right, shaped like a pear. And it was inserted.
Inserted where?
Well, that's the thing. The mouth, rectum, or vagina. Then the torturer would turn a screw, and the pear would slowly expand.
Oh, my God. That's just, I don't even know what to say. What was the point of that, besides just inflicting unimaginable pain?
Well, it was about humiliation, too, control.
Yeah.
They often used it on women accused of, witchcraft or prostitution, a way to silence them, punish them.
Ugh. It's amazing how these punishments targeted the most vulnerable so often. Women, minorities.
Yeah.
Really says something.
Eh.
But okay, we've got to ask, what could be worse than gibbeting than that pear? What takes the gold medal in this horrific competition?
This one, it's the stuff of nightmares, really. Back to China for this one. The tiger bench.
Tiger bench. Okay, we talked about the Kang, how it immobilized people. This sounds way more intense, though.
It was. Imagine being tied down to a bench, limbs stretched out, and then...
Then what? Don't leave me hanging.
They'd put these blocks of wood under your feet, sometimes bricks, and slowly add more, increasing the tension on your legs, forcing your body into these, well, unnatural positions.
Ouch. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I read about broken bones, dislocated joints. The pain must have been unimaginable.
It was, but it's the slowness that makes it so horrific. The gradual tearing could go on for hours, even days.
Awful.
And often they'd use sharp instruments too, further mutilate the victim, all while they were still conscious.
It's hard to even wrap your mind around that kind of cruelty. Didn't they use that during, like, Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution?
They did. And it wasn't just for criminals, it was for anyone they considered an enemy, anyone who disagreed, who challenged their ideology.
It's chilling, you know?
Yeah,
It makes you think we may not have the tiger bench anymore, but are there things we do today that future generations will look back on with that same horror?
it's a question worth asking.
Definitely. Well, this deep dive has been, well, I'm not going to lie, it's been pretty dark. Disturbing even.
Okay.
But it's important to confront these parts of history
Absolutely.
because it's the only way to learn from them to hopefully create a better future.